Hello, I'm Jack Shagner.
And I'm Henry Peden. On July 4th, 1776, some 250 years ago, representatives from 13 American colonies signed the Declaration of Independence, declaring their freedom from British rule. Great Britain had already gone to war to prevent this from happening, as they regarded the status quo was financially and militarily more beneficial.
Since 1607, when the British established the first permanent settlement in America at Jamestown, trade with the colonies had benefited the mother country, and in the 1770s they would fight a war to preserve this relationship.
During the Revolutionary War, there were no battles fought in Harford, but the county was very involved in supporting the American cause. The following program begins with setting the stage prior to the war and ends with the British surrender at Yorktown.
This Revolutionary War story is narrated by Terry Troyer.
In 1607, when the first permanent English settlement in America was established at Jamestown, the sponsors had hoped to find gold, but their expectations went up in smoke. Nevertheless, a decade later in 1616, the first Virginia pipe tobacco found its way to England, catching the fancy of the public, thereby becoming a significant import. Further up the Chesapeake Bay, Maryland would be settled in 1634 and contribute to saltweed production, with Great Britain's tobacco imports rising to 102,000 pounds by 1775. The first Harford County settlers along Bush River Neck and Gunpowder Neck grew tobacco that was exported, with the proceeds used to acquire manufactured British goods such as pottery, ironware, and woven cloth. Repeated yearly growth of tobacco, however, depleted the soil of nutrients, requiring follow-on colonists to migrate further inland. Harford County's Bel Air seat was actually built on Scott's Old Fields, a descriptor of soil no longer useful for growing tobacco. The propensity to smoke tobacco had been embraced by the English despite the fact that King James I had written in 1604 an anti-smoking treatise titled A Counterblast to Tobacco, describing it as a custom loathsome to the eye, hateful to the nose, harmful to the brain, and dangerous to the lungs. He was strongly against smoking, seeing it as a vile habit, though paradoxically, he later taxed it heavily and even monopolized the trade for royal profit. Great Britain was a maritime power with mighty ships that consumed much wood and iron in their construction. With domestic resources beginning to dwindle, it was logical to import wooden staves for barrels to hold fresh water for long voyages. In addition, they imported from America so-called shooks, which consisted of staves, heads, and hoops that had been assembled into a barrel and then broken down into a smaller volume for shipping. The production of iron depended on heat supplied by charcoal that was derived from the trees, thus also depleting the forest. By 1719, the British had established an iron foundry in Cecil County called Principio that by 1770 was yearly exporting 45,868 tons of pig iron to England. As well, their ships required so-called naval stores, which consisted of turpentine for disinfecting, along with hemp and tar for sealing crevices between boards in their wooden hulls. Early on, their supplies came from the New England colonies, but with the depletion of local pine trees by about 1750, naval stores production transitioned south to North Carolina and other nearby colonies. Another exported product was gunpowder that was a mixture of sulfur, charcoal, and potassium nitrate called saltpeter, as these ingredients could be found in America. New England also supplied dried salted cod that provided year-round protein and whale oil used in lamps for nighttime illumination. Also, beaver pelts were used for making high-quality waterproof felt hats, as the beaver population in Europe was on the decline. From the lower colonies, Great Britain also imported indigo and rice. Flour, fish, and meat were also shipped to the British West Indies, with the vessels returning with sugar and molasses that was made into rum for the colonists. Monies derived from the sale of the foregoing products was used by colonists to acquire manufactured English goods, such as textiles, iron pots, brass kettles, woolen blankets, knives, saws, axes, firearms, and for some wealthy families, porcelainware, furniture, and other luxuries. This was an ongoing relationship that benefited both Great Britain and the colonies that were scattered along the Atlantic coast of America from New Hampshire to Georgia. The French, however, had settled Canada and were constructing forts below the Great Lakes, threatening the prosperity of English colonial trade. This led to the French and Indian War, when the British drove the French out. Great Britain had won the French and Indian War and gained territory, but the victory had come at a huge financial price. Therefore, British ministers began to push the colonists to bear some of the cost. The Americans argued that England was responsible to defend their territories, and besides, the colonists had aided Great Britain in the war as much as the British had aided them. Furthermore, Canada was now under British rule, and that amply remunerated England for her financial expenses. Besides, in a future war, the Americans would try to fight their own battles. Nevertheless, the war had cost Great Britain a whopping £70,000, doubling or almost doubling their national debt. So they would aggressively reach out to the colonies for financial help. King George III ascended the throne in 1760, and his personal character became a precursor to the future problems in dealing with the colonies. A historian writing in 1883 penned this unflattering description. He was one of the worst monarchs of modern times. His notions of government were altogether despotic. He was a stubborn, stupid, thick-headed man in whose mind the notion of human rights was entirely wanting. It was impossible for him to conceive of a magnanimous project or to appreciate the value of civil liberty. His reign of 60 years was as odious as it was long. In the management of the British Empire, he employed only those who were the narrow-minded partisans of his policy. His ministers were, for the most part, men as incompetent and illiberal as himself. With such a king and such a ministry, it was not likely that the descendants of the Pilgrims would get on smoothly. In 1733, Great Britain had passed the Molasses Act, imposing a tax on each gallon of imported molasses, but it had never been effective due to colonial evasion such as smuggling. In 1764, the Parliament of Great Britain passed the Sugar Act that decreased the molasses tax rate, hoping to increase revenues therefrom for defraying the expenses of defending and protecting the colonies. The Sugar Act, however, increased the concern of colonists and was a factor that helped the growing movement to become independent. The following year, in 1765, Parliament approved the Stamp Act that required the colonists to pay for a royal stamp on legal documents, pamphlets, ship papers, almanac, and newspapers, the proceeds of which were to fund British military expenses. It was the first direct tax on the colonists and triggered immense colonial protest, widespread boycotts, and the phrase, "no tax without representation." Colonists grumbled, complaining as Englishmen they could only be taxed by their own elected representatives. In Virginia, Patrick Henry, the youngest member of the House of Burgess, representing Louisa County, anticipated that some of the oldest delegates would lead the charge in opposition to the Parliament, but none rose to the occasion. He hastily drew up a series of fiery resolutions that were hotly debated and in part passed. Being the oldest American Commonwealth, this had the effect of promoting similar resolutions by other assemblies in the colonies. With mounting opposition, the act was being stamped to death, and on April 10, 1766, the Maryland Gazette announced Parliament's repeal of the Stamp Act. Also in 1765, the British passed the Quartering Act that required the colonies to provide food, including beer, shelter in public houses and inn, as well as supplies such as candles and transportation for British soldiers stationed in America. The act was heavily opposed by the colonists and increased tensions with the British government, contributing to the taxation without representation sentiment. The Declaratory Act, passed in 1766, asserted Parliament's absolute authority to make laws that were binding on the American colonies, in all cases whatsoever. It was passed immediately after the repeal of the despised Stamp Act of 1765, the aim to assert control despite colonial protest of taxation without representation. While one tax was removed, the Declaratory Act fundamentally reinstated Parliament's sovereignty and continued to fueling further discontent, leading to the American Revolution. While the foregoing British acts were permeating in the colonies, a further 1773 restriction known as the Tea Act would cause the discontent kettle to boil over. Colonists had been importing tea smuggled by Dutch traders that circumvented Britain from collecting their 3 penny per pound import tax on British tea. The Tea Act granted a monopoly to the British East India Tea Company to bypass British merchants, thereby lowering the price, and then sell directly to the colonies. While the price of tea was lowered, colonists saw this as a trick to force them into paying the import tax, thereby accepting Parliament's right to tax them. The colonists reacted by refusing to buy British tea, and protest erupted. In Boston, a group of men led by Samuel Adams met at Boston's Green Dragon Tavern to plan a retaliatory act against the British. On December 16, 1773, the Sons of Liberty, disguised as Mohawk Native Americans, boarded 3 ships carrying British East India tea and tossed over 342 chests of tea into the Boston harbor. No doubt inspired by the tea reprisal in Boston, in October 1774, the Peggy Stewart docked in the Annapolis harbor was forced to be burned by an angry mob as it transported tea. On the eastern shore in Chestertown, just south of the Sassafras River, tradition states that in May 1774, angry citizens gathered in the center of town, then marched down to the harbor where the brigantine Geddes was anchored and tossed her cargo of tea overboard. In 1774, the British Parliament passed the Coercive Acts to punish Massachusetts for the Boston Tea Party. These so-called intolerable acts closed Boston Harbor and allowed British officials to evade local courts. While intended to isolate radicals, these actions ignited and unified colonial resistance that directly led to the First Continental Congress. 12 of the 13 colonies met at Carpenter's Hall in Philadelphia beginning on September 5, 1774, to address the blockade of the Boston Harbor and the intolerable acts passed by the British Parliament. As adopted by Congress, the Continental Association's main provisions were to establish a widespread boycott of British products. This included the non-importation of British goods, the non-consumption of their products, and non-exportation of colonial goods or products aimed to pressure Britain economically by banning imports and halting exports, while also fostering internal American unity through local enforcement committees, prompting self-sufficiency through increased wool production and homespun goods, and punishing violators as foes to liberty through public shaming. Harford County's government had been established in March 1774, and through the Harford Resolves encouraged a peaceful resolution with Great Britain. On June 11, 1774, a large group of inhabitants of Harford County met at Bush, the county seat, under the chairmanship of Captain Aquila Hall, then the county's wealthiest and most influential citizen. As Captain Hall spoke, the tension of the crowd increased. He described the plight of the people of Boston, the act of Parliament and their injustice, the efforts which have been made to petition Parliament and King George for redress of their grievances. He reported their negative results. At the conclusion of his recital, he read the following 7 policy resolutions and moved for their unanimous adoption. These policies are summarized as 1. It is the duty of every colony to assist Boston in her plight. 2. Harford County will join other counties in not exporting to Great Britain on a date to be set by a committee. 3. We will not deal with West India Islands unless they support our cause. 4. We will join with other colonies to send relief to poor and distressed inhabitants of Boston. 5. We will urge merchants not to increase their prices. 6. Lawyers should not pursue payment of debts held by individuals in Great Britain. And 7. A committee is appointed to consult and agree on the most effective means to preserve our constitutional right and liberties. Furthermore, on June 11, 1774, at Hungerford's Tavern in Rockville, a group of Maryland patriots met to add their support to Boston and proclaimed that to achieve American independence, all trade with Great Britain should be broken off. In Harford County on March 22, 1775, 34 elected individuals acting as the Committee of Harford County met in a rented house at Bush along Old Philadelphia Road and signed the Bush Declaration. Their names are identified on a historic marker. The text of the Bush Declaration was, "We, the Committee of Harford County, having most seriously and maturely considered the resolves and association of the Continental Congress and the resolves of the Provincial Convention, do most heartily approve of the same, and as we esteem ourselves in a more particular manner entrusted by our constituents to see them carried into execution, we do most solemnly pledge ourselves to each other and to our country, and engage ourselves by every tie held sacred among mankind, to perform the same at the risk of our lives and fortunes." These declarations anticipated a possible war with Great Britain, and Harford County had to be prepared. On December 24, 1774, the first militia company was formed at what is now Churchville, and Dr. John Archer was chosen as captain. In 1775, 17 militia companies were formed, as well as 2 rifle companies. The British sensed a disharmony amongst the colonists of Boston and became concerned about a possible military attack. They decided to undertake their own preemptive skirmish, and word leaked out to the colonists. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, in his epic poem titled Paul Revere's Midnight Ride, tells the story. "Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere. On the 18th of April in 75, hardly a man is now alive who remembers the famous day and year. He said to his friend, 'If the British march by land or sea from the town tonight, hang a lantern aloft in the belfry arch of the North Church Tower as a signal light, one if by land and 2 if by sea, and I on the opposite shore will be, ready to ride and spread the alarm through every Middlesex village and farm, for the country folk to be up and to arm.' On April 19, 1775, the British attacked Lexington and Concord with plans to seize weapons and ammunitions that were being stored by the Americans. By depriving the colonists of weapons of war, this action could possibly suppress the growing rebellion against British rule and prevent further acts of resistance. Dubbed the shot that was heard around the world, this raid triggered the beginning of the American Revolutionary War. Boston was now the hotbed of hostile British actions, and the colonists fully understood they alone could not be successful in defeating Great Britain in a war. Victory would only be possible through a coordinated effort from all 13 colonies, so they promoted images of the message, "Join or die." On May 10, 1775, a little under 1 month after the British moved on Concord and Lexington, the Second Continental Congress convened at Philadelphia inside Independence Hall with representatives from 12 of the 13 colonies. The first order of business was to manage the war effort, whereupon on June 15, 1775, John Adams nominated George Washington for his military experience, who was unanimously elected to lead colonial forces against the British. He accepted officially taking command on July 3, 1775. Next, the delegates drafted the Olive Branch Petition and sent it to King George III in hopes of reaching a peaceful resolution, but the petition was rejected. Later, Congress would send Benjamin Franklin to Paris, becoming France's first official representative from the United States. Franklin and others would work with the French government to secure secret shipments of weapons, equipment, and uniforms to support the American cause of achieving independence from Great Britain. A committee consisting of Thomas Jefferson from Virginia, John Adams, Massachusetts, Benjamin Franklin, Pennsylvania, Robert R. Livingston, New York, and Roger Sherman, Connecticut, was appointed by the delegates to draft a Declaration of Independence from Great Britain. Because of his demonstrated skills as a writer, Jefferson was chosen to prepare a draft. Working in isolation for 17 days, residing on the second floor of a rented home, he prepared a draft and, after consulting with Adams and Franklin, made minor revisions before submitting it to the Congress on June 28th. The Continental Congress debated and edited the draft, finally adopting it on July 4, 1776. The closing words were, "We mutually pledge to each other our lives and our fortunes and our sacred honor." These words are similar to those of the earlier Bush Declaration that read, "We most solemnly pledge to each other at the risk of our lives and fortunes." John Hancock, president of the Second Continental Congress, was the first to sign the Declaration of Independence and did so in a large, bold signature. His prominent signature became synonymous with the term John Hancock for a person's signature. Harford County's William Peka of Chilbury Hall near Abington was a signer of the Declaration of Independence. Later, he would become a chief judge of the General Court of Maryland in 1778 and governor of the state from 1782 to 1785. He also served as a delegate to the Maryland Convention that adopted the federal Constitution in 1788 and became a federal district judge appointed by President Washington, serving from 1789 to 1799. William Peka Elementary School along Old Post Road was named in his honor. However, his name was removed by the Harford County School Board recently because it was pointed out that he owned slaves. Washington took command of a ragtag group of soldiers and volunteers who had little military training and set out to deliver a victory for the American cause. He moved his troops to New York, where British General Howe was marshaling ships and his army. The enemy launched an attack on the American position at Harlem Heights, where he ordered up reinforcements, which consisted largely of Maryland troops. In his report to Congress, he wrote, "Marylanders charged the enemy with great spirit and drove them from the wood into the plain." While there were no Revolutionary War battles fought in Harford County, military troops supporting the American cause passed through the county on their way south to Yorktown. In particular, soldiers led by Frenchman Lafayette and Count Rochambeau made this journey. Also, several thousand Harford Countyans collectively signed the Association of Freemen of Maryland in 1775 and 1776 and took the oath of allegiance and fidelity in 1778. They also rendered patriotic support by providing food, horses, and guns. When Major General Lafayette reached the head of Elk River in Cecil County in March 1781, he found letters from General Washington ordering him to move south through Maryland to assist General Greene. Lafayette then dispatched a letter dated March 10th to Maryland Governor Thomas Sim Lee that he intended to march the following day and would need horses and wagons in Baltimore to assist in the Southern campaign. On the morning of March 11th, the army under the command of Lafayette left the head of Elk and marched generally northwest through Cecil County to the Brick Meeting House, where they camped in the nearby woods. The next night, on April 12, 1781, the troops camped in the area of Richard's Oak, and the following morning, Lafayette's troops proceeded to Bald Friar, where a rock ledge across the Susquehanna River had allowed Native Americans to ford the river. At this time, however, large flat-bottomed boats called scows were being operated by a bald-headed man called Fry, with the crossing name having been corrupted to Bald Friar. These scows would have likely been used to transport wagons with provisions, while the horses and soldiers waded across into Harford County. The scow in which Lafayette was crossing stuck on a submerged rock near the shore, and Aquila Deaver, a soldier who lived in Harford County, carried him from the scow to the shore on his back. After crossing, the army marched southeast along the river to the crossroads settlement of Berkeley, where Lafayette, Major Caleb Gibbs, Brigadier General Moses Hazen, Major Nicholas Fish, and other officers were quartered in the house of Colonel James Rigby. The large, almost square left side frame section had been built by Colonel Nathan Rigby in 1731. Alexis Shriver, writing in 1931, reported, "It was in this part of the house stayed Lafayette and his officers on the night of April 13, 1781. The kitchen fireplace was big enough to cook food for all of the officers and aides. The poor troops, without shoes, clothes, or tents, fared less happily under the stars in the fields around the house, sleeping beneath the impressed Cecil County wagons." After Lafayette passed through Harford County, he reached Baltimore on April 18, 1781. Not far behind Lafayette, in early September 1781, General Washington and his troops convened at the head of Elk, also en route to Yorktown. Count Rochambeau and his French troops arrived at the lower ferry on the Susquehanna River opposite present-day Havre de Grace in early September 1771. Men and supplies were transported across using rented flat-bottom boats from the upstream Smith's Ferry between Harford County and Port Deposit. On September 9, 1781, a short distance south of Havre de Grace, Count Rochambeau and his troops camped at the site along the Old Post Road. This location at the present-day intersection of Revolution Street and Lewis Lane is identified by a Maryland historic marker. Meanwhile, Rochambeau's heavy artillery and baggage train were sent to Bald Friar to cross the Susquehanna River using scows. One of his officers, Baron von Kosen, kept a diary that was later published wherein he described the crossing as diabolique, which translates in English as diabolical, suggestive of a place inhabited by the devil. On September 10, 1781, the Count's heavy artillery camped near a source of fresh water known as Indian Spring before heading to Bush and joining the main troops. An Indian Spring historic marker identifies the location. Meanwhile, Count Rochambeau and his troops near Havre de Grace continued to head south along the Old Post Road and made their next camp at Bushtown, where the map on the left was drawn by his staff. The upper blue line represents the tributary Bynum Run, joined by the lower James Run. A little later in September 1781, General George Washington with his American Continental Army, Comte de Rochambeau with his French army, and Comte de Grasse, commanding a French naval force, converged on Yorktown, and a siege began on September the 28th. The British were surrounded, and being unable to be resupplied, British General Lord Cornwallis was forced to surrender to General Washington on October 19, 1781. The Treaty of Paris, signed on September 3, 1783, officially ended the war.
Many years ago, the British Crown imposed a tax on tea in Boston town. Their anger fled, they tossed it to the sea. From this bold act they came to learn, the British closed the port. In city streets the gunfire churned, and terror soon was wrought. The colonies then rushed to aid, a bitter fight began. Together all the people prayed that freedom's cause would stand.